This man flopping like a fish can teach you a lot about the fundamental nature of how strength works. It's all about channeling momentum. This technique is called a kipping escape. This grappler is using the fluttering motion of his legs to channel momentum into his upper body that he then uses to push away and manipulate his opponent. In the realm of lifting weights, these motions where entire body momentum is funneled into the limbs being trained or the weights being moved tend to be much more subtle. But they exist everywhere at the elite levels of strength and bodybuilding. The goal of this video is to first demonstrate to you just how dominant momentum channeling is in the world of lifting. Then, I'll try to give you some of my reasoning as to why I think it makes for not just better strength performance, but much more effective training when compared to strict repetitions. Lastly, I'll talk about how kipping or momentum channeling is actually a little more involved than you might think, and I'll get into some of the intricacies about how it works and how you can use it in your own training. First, let's take a look at this guy. He's one of the strongest calisthenics athletes in the world, and the way he does pull-ups is very, very similar to how we just saw that grappler use the kipping escape. In order to trigger the ascent of his pull-up, he is using a leg motion to initiate the movement. You can see something that's further away from a kipping escape, but follows a similar concept in Julius Maddox's bench press, and specifically his leg drive. Maddox is one of the strongest benchers who's ever lived, and every rep of every set he does, seemingly in training and in competition, uses a powerful lower body kip to set up his strict bench press. Not even the strict curl world record is safe from momentum. I'll keep playing this video back as I talk about this, but if you pay attention, the lift is initiated by a powerful leg extension, and there's an entire body tension follow through as the curl is performed. This also exists on lower body lifts. It's not like an upper body only thing. Here you can see me using momentum channeling to take the energy of me dropping into my setup, which I then funnel into my upper back in order to whip the bar off the ground when deadlifting. Again, that's another thing that's conventionally thought of as being a pure, strict, no momentum lift, and no one at the elite level is doing it that way. It's very important to highlight here that momentum isn't just being used in exhibition. It's not a tactic for strength efficiency just to put up more weight in competition. It's used extensively during training. There's actually, I think, good scientific reason as to why kipping would make training more effective. And I think it solves a couple paradoxical little quirks that exist in the exercise science data regarding how muscles grow, are used, and adapt. First, it's well established that muscles are much stronger eccentrically. That is, in the lowering phase of a movement. And often people can lift 50% or more extra weight in a negative than they can concentrically. And it's also very well established that eccentrics seem to be more relevant to muscle growth than concentrics are. Using momentum can often let you use 30 to 50% more weight concentrically than you would otherwise be able to. And if you combine that with a controlled negative, you're now utilizing your full eccentric strength and gaining your full hypertrophic benefit from using it. That's not even considering the fact that during a large portion of the concentric, you're still going way beyond what you'd have to otherwise if you were performing strict rep. Another quirk in the way muscles work is that they're primarily better at normalizing stresses that they've already been through. They do not readily gain performance or ability. You can very reliably have people learn and adapt to surviving extremely brutal training regimens and becoming more efficient at performing those regimens. Gaining reps or strength is way, way harder, and the stronger you get, the less reliable it becomes. The fact that muscles operate this way is usually a huge hindrance to strict training because it makes it very difficult to gain ability. When it comes to kipping, this ends up being sort of a loophole that can be exploited. If your body normalizes going 120% over your strict limits, because you've essentially overclocked your body using momentum, that normalization process increases your strict ability beyond its original max. And this concept has been kind of anecdotally well established in fitness, just in very specific domains. It's pretty well understood that the best way to achieve your first strict pull-up is to gain the ability to do tons and tons of negatives. And once you can do negatives on pull-ups and start training them regularly, your pulling up ability grows explosively. Again, you're normalizing 1/2 of the strict motion until the strict motion comes to you with much less effort. Kipping style rows have also been used by a lot of people to dramatically increase their strict ability. And momentum infused rowing used to be like a trend like 5 or so years ago in the natural lifting community, where a lot of people had tons of success with them, especially people like bucenhagan and alphadestiny. The style of rowing eventually fell out of favor, and I think a big reason for it brings me actually very neatly to my next point about kipping and how to use it effectively in your training. I think people essentially confuse cheat reps with kipping and momentum in general. I define kipping as using momentum in a way that reinforces a strict movement pattern. I think the best example of this is something like a push press, where after the initial leg drive, there is still a pretty much strict press that follows it. A key thing to note here is that the direction that my body is moving during the kip is consistent with the direction that the bar is moving throughout the entire rep. Now let's contrast this with cheating. So the effective cheat of a push press would be something like a jerk, which skips the strict pressing motion completely. I think a key feature of cheat reps is that the direction that your body is moving during the momentum channeling changes throughout the lift. So if you see in like the jerk, there is a dropping motion before the bar is finished moving. The reason these two things should be kept very distinct is because kipping definitely increases the overall stress, fatigue, and stimulus of training, but cheating largely negates it, at least in the muscle groups that you'd be attempting to train in the strict version of whatever you're cheating. And I think conflating the two is probably what gave momentum in general a bad rap in fitness. And the reason back training was partially immune to this conflation is because the lengthened position at the bottom of the lift is still valuable enough to where you could still reap some of the benefits of rowing and shrugs and whatnot, even if you're doing them in a cheating style instead of a kipping style. And the lack of this effect is probably why no one ever really advocated for cheated pressing. I think what eventually ended up happening is that the logistics of moving heavier and heavier weights became too inconvenient for cheat rows to continue being popular, and a misunderstanding of why they might have worked led people to start ignoring the eccentrics, which would have been their saving grace given that they skip a large portion of the concentric using cheating instead of kipping. The next thing that I think is very important to understand is that there's a timing element to using momentum properly. In every example that I've showed you so far, I've been very sure to indicate whatever movement is being used to generate momentum has come before the strict motion that is going to be empowered by it. They do not happen simultaneously. And to get an understanding of why you wouldn't want them to happen simultaneously, it's kind of similar to pushing a child on a swing. If you push them during a certain window of time, you would actually slow them down. If you push them at another window of time, you would begin to speed them up, and their momentum would be added to your push. Stuff like that happens in lifting because there's an equal and opposite reaction anytime you're exerting strength. So if we go back and take the example of Julius Manox's bench press, if he were to press at the same time his legs were in transition and moving, the recoil of his strict press would slam his hips back into the bench and he'd essentially be fighting and canceling his own strength. Whereas if he timed the press in sequence to follow immediately after his hip extension, that recoil gets absorbed by a strong and stable foundation of his locked hip position.
Now you don't go anywhere, and the reason why is you apply a force into the ground in action, and there's a reaction force from the ground pushing back on you.
Now into the actual practical application. I think that there are broadly two kinds of kipping, and I call them expansion kipping or flexion kipping. Expansion kipping is best exemplified and emphasized by the overhead medicine ball throw. Wave of momentum that you're generating to move a weight takes your body from a relatively flexed position into an extended position, and it turns your limbs from internal rotation into external rotation. In real man exercise, you see the same movement pattern play out in the deadlift, where the body starts in a flexed position with the limbs in internal rotation, and ends in an extended position with the limbs in external rotation, and momentum is used to achieve that transition. You can also see these expansion mechanics in Eric Spoto's JM press, where he clearly rounds his body to set up each rep, and uses kipping to expand his body and twist his arms externally as he goes through each concentric. Flexion kipping is the opposite pattern, and is best demonstrated, again by throwing a medicine ball, but this time throwing it from a top position down. Momentum is used to take the body from an extended and expanded position with the limbs in external rotation, and pull them into flexion and internal rotation. On big boy lifts, you see this kind of mechanic on, weirdly enough, high bar back squats, where you'll notice here Clarence Kennedy descends into a very exaggerated external rotation of his femurs and external rotation of his shoulders and an extended body position. Then you'll see his elbows and his sternum drop as he violently pulls into the bar to kip momentum and help him complete the lift in a flexion pattern, which is kind of weird because he's standing up. But his legs go into internal rotation and so do his shoulders, and he kind of jellyfishes himself up in a rounded posture. You also see flexion kipping in the lat dominant style of pull-ups that I showed earlier, where the body's being clearly pulled into a rounded posture, using the momentum of the legs. All that's really important to note here is that using certain kinds of kipping mechanics works best when they align with the proper rotation mechanics. Kipping expansively while trying to do a lat dominant pull-up is just not a very efficient energy transfer. but would be ideal for something like an upper back dominant row. Lastly, there are a bunch of much more subtle ways to generate momentum that I've previously covered in other videos, and that can be used more or less interchangeably no matter what style of kipping you're using. I'll just go over these pretty quickly. You can whip your hand into contraction in a way that generates a pulse of momentum through your upper body, very similar to how boxers finish their punches from an open fist into a closed one. A similar concept also exists when flexing the feet, and that can also be used to empower lifts. Even much more subtle things like breathing can be used to influence lifts in a similar way. In this video, I talk about how I inhale and clench my teeth as I go through concentrics, which is pretty contrary to how most people usually hold their breath. What I now realize that I'm doing is that I'm actually using the momentum of my chest expanding during my inhale to help assist me in moving weights. And I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list of every method that exists to generate momentum. I'm also sure that, like the other examples of momentum channeling, lots and lots and lots of people at the elite level are probably doing all kinds of stuff like this, maybe just intuitively, to make their training more effective and stimulatory. I hope you guys found this video helpful. I know it was a pretty weird one, but this style of kind of esoteric lifting philosophy and principles are really the things I'm most obsessed about in my training. So I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have about this concept in the comments down below.